Good evening, you all. Hope you've had a great day with your tours and your breakout sessions. We are ending with a real bang here this evening with Ed Ayers. Many of you know Ed's work. Those of you who have come to Gettysburg for the Fortinball lecture, Ed delivered the Fortinball 3 years ago, I believe, 3 years ago. Ed has a remarkable career because not only is he a successful teacher and scholar, but he also has been a college president at the University of Richmond. He is now President Emeritus, I should say, and as you can take a look at Ed, he's 5 years younger, right, since you have stepped down from that position. And he is now serves as the Tucker Boatwright Professor of the Humanities, and he has, before he got to the University of Richmond, for several years he was the Dean of Arts and Sciences at UVA, where he began his teaching career in 1980. I was in junior high in 1980, just to get some perspective for the audience, just get some perspective, that's all. Over the course of his distinguished career, he has written and edited several books, including The Promise of the New South, Life After Reconstruction, which I believe is the book to the right of me. It is a fantastic book. I mentioned to you all C. Van Woodward. C. Van Woodward was not your mentor, is that correct? He was.
I took the last class here.
So he took C. Van Woodward's last class. One of Woodward's classics is The Origins of the New South. This book, I believe, is a compliment. Some reviewers saw it as a critique of Woodward's. It's not even close to being that, I don't believe. It's a fantastic book. It's more of a cultural and social history that accompanies what C. Van Woodward did. It is well worth your time. All right, since then, I should add that this book, Promise of the New South, it was a finalist for both the National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize. For those of you who might be familiar with Ed's work in terms of Civil War writings, you maybe have come across Presence of Mine Enemies, Civil War in the Heart of America. He won the Bancroft Prize for that and the Beveridge Prize as well. As many of you know, Presence of the Mine of Enemies, it's a comparative study, Augusta County, Virginia, and just down the road here in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. It has now just finished volume 2, and it is going to be released next year. All right. So a lot of the work for that study was based upon a project that he had started at the University of Virginia. It was a digital project when nobody was doing digital projects. And that digital project, I'm trying to find the title of it here, and of course it's The Valley of the Shadow. We have a few individuals who are on faculty here this week who were part of that, who were Ed's graduate students. I'm not going to have them stand up. Every time I've asked Ed, I've asked people to stand up for various awards, and they're never in the audience, so I'm not doing that anymore. I'm done with that. But Susanna Lee, Watson Jennison, I know they both worked on the project. Carrie Jane, who's all the way in the back, I'm quite certain she didn't work on the project, did she? No? But she's one of your students. She's back there. Carrie, you can raise your hand. Did you work on Ed's Valley of the Shadow?
As an undergraduate.
Wow.
Sweet.
I was part of the experiment phase.
All right. And so I should add that Ed has trained countless students who are now working in the field in Southern history and Civil War history. And as I said before, we have 3 of them here. I don't think I've overlooked any. Watson, Susanna, and Carrie. Just recently, this is quite an announcement. President Barack Obama recently awarded Ed the National Humanities Medal and appointed him to the National Council of Humanities. Ed will conclude our programming today with Reckoning with Reconstruction and its sesquicentennial. Let's welcome Ed Ayers.
Hey, good evening, everybody. I know you've been out traipsing the hot battlefields and traipsing the hot fields of historiography and thinking about Reconstruction. I'm a little intimidated to be coming in after all that, but I'm also honored. And, you know, I'm intimidated too because you folks actually know something about Reconstruction now that you treated know a couple days ago. And by the fact that you're here shows you're curious about it. But I've talked about this around the country, and I'm pretty sure that most Americans would say of the parts of American history they don't know, Reconstruction would be the top. And people aren't even really embarrassed by that. They just say, yeah, Reconstruction. What was that thing, you know? And but here's what I think they do know. People know that it lasted 12 years, from 1865 to 1877, because that's when their textbooks, Volume 1 and Volume 2, always divide. They know it was a terrible thing that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and it was a terrible thing that Andrew Johnson became president. They know that black people briefly held political power, which was, for generations, considered orthodoxy among many white people. That was a terrible thing, and now people think it was a great thing, a sort of a precursor to the delayed justice of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, some people know different pieces of Reconstruction, but not really where it fits into the story. People know that the promise of 40 acres and a mule was made and rescinded somewhere along the way. People know that the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution appeared at some time in that process. People often know about the black coats. I saw the great materials that you were presented with when you began, the great primary materials you see about the black coats there. And people know that Reconstruction kind of ended with a kind of corrupt bargain of some sort in 1877. And then people think that after Reconstruction, Southern history pretty much was put on hold until the 1960s, even though I wrote a book 25 freaking years ago that argued just the contrary. And people insist on believing that. But I need to let it go and move on. And the bottom line is that Reconstruction used to be considered a failure because it happened at all. And now it's considered a failure because it didn't go far enough when there might have been a moment to had real justice in this country. Now, one reason Reconstruction is hard to understand, even if you study it carefully, is that its many changes over a vast landscape and 12 years do not have many of the elements of a story. As soon as Lincoln's assassinated, the storylines get tangled. The chronology gets tangled. The main characters come and go. After a dramatic cameo, even Andrew Johnson is shoved off stage, and then Thaddeus Stevens dies halfway through the drama. The radical Republicans, the carpetbaggers, the scalawags, who sound as if they would be interesting with those names, in our imaginations are faceless and nameless. Quick, name a carpetbagger, or maybe you can't, but name a scalawag. You know? And the story starts and then stops, and each state has its own chronology. And so you look at this map in the textbooks, and it shows you every textbook has the same one. It has the states, the years the states came back into the Union. And they're different. And so what's with that? I'm just going to go ahead and get to the Gilded Age. It was gilded. That must be fun. So this talk of a narrative, lack of a narrative arc, is one of the reasons I think that people do not even think they know anything about Reconstruction. There's no simple framework of the sort that people can hold on to, such as Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War, even though it was suspiciously in the middle, which makes me wonder, was it really, or was it just because it divides things into two equal parts? We'll talk about that a little bit later, maybe. There seems to have been largely chaos, sliced in different shapes for each southern state. Our greatest book on the subject, by Eric Foner, its subtitle is America's Unfinished Revolution, which intentionally raises questions about when and how that revolution might finally be brought to fruition. So how do we clarify Reconstruction without oversimplifying Reconstruction? We've moved beyond the caricatures of Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, but we've not put another comprehensible story in its place. And those stories, of course, do a great disservice to Reconstruction. The fact that the most popular movie per capita in American history tells the story of Reconstruction from the viewpoint of a woman who was relatively privileged. So what's the story of the enslaved people? Where is that? Maybe it's going to be this new Matthew McConaughey movie. We'll see. Here's one suggestion. Let's begin by defining Reconstruction to see as if we were looking at it from a great distance. Then you might say that the point of Reconstruction is the reconstitution of the United States without slavery. Now, this does not diminish all the other things that Reconstruction was. But I think if you read over the shoulders of the Republicans who are, including Abraham Lincoln, who are directing this is what they think that they are doing by the middle of the Civil War. They're trying to put the country back together without slavery in it. Now that leaves a lot of things that it can be, and a lot of ways you can get there, but I think that's what the Republicans think they were doing. And they were consistent across the entire era. Their goal was to remove the slaveholding power so that free institutions could flourish across the South and across the nation, so that the United States could be truly united. Now, this is what Lincoln said in different ways in all his speeches, different vocabularies. And Republican commitment to that consistent purpose meant that they changed strategies and tactics as conditions dictated. They sometimes expanded when internal logic suggests they sometimes retracted. The change in scope of their purpose accelerated in just a few months. And so if you turn up the magnification on Reconstruction, it's even more confusing than if you just know the things that Americans know about it. That it lasted this period of time, that it had these guys in it. Now the Republicans first had to destroy the most fundamental threat posed by slaveholders, the dissolution of the Union. When the slaveholders forced the hand of Republicans who would never, including Abraham Lincoln, he thinks that slavery might end by about 1965. When he's running, he thinks that the strangling of slavery might eventually call it to kill itself and fade away. But the Southerners do the only thing that could have triggered all this, which is to secede. And then that process begins to cascade. That's what In the Presence of My Enemies is all about. How it was that Americans basically talked and voted themselves into a war that everybody claimed not to want. Then Volume 2 is how in the world did that turn into the end of the largest, most powerful system of slavery in the modern world. Something that's not apparent, that's going to happen at the turning point of the Civil War, supposedly right here where we are. So the Republicans first had to destroy this, and they had to do that with military force. Then to win the resulting military struggle, they undermined slavery and enlisted enslaved men to become soldiers fighting for their own freedom. After the slaveholders' rebellion had been crushed, they had to remove the threat of individuals who would reignite the rebellion or sustain it in other forms. They did that with oaths and with prescriptions against voting. The economic and legal foundations of the slaveholding power had to be destroyed by replacing coercion with right to work for wages. This is unless you destroy slavery, which is the ownership of people by other people, none of the other purposes of Reconstruction can come to pass. There cannot be a true reunification of the nation if you have the coercion of labor in something that looks like slavery. To sustain those rights, they had to remove the constitutional foundations that had created the slaveholding power in the first place, the 3/5 clause and its consequences, which meant they had to create universal suffrage. And the Democrats of the North resisted Republicans at every step except for the military effort. Okay? Those are huge amount of changes in a small amount of time, and they all cascade into each other. So there is a consistency of the Republicans' vision and the power behind their actions, even though there is an apparent inconsistency in a lot of the things that they do. So it doesn't do to try to explain away contradiction and complexity as to say, no, that's just static, let's get to the bottom line. Instead, we have to embrace those things as the story itself. So, what they discovered is that they simply could not force white Southerners to change their self-righteous belief that they had never been wrong. A lot of the energy of Reconstruction is devoted to trying to change the hearts and minds of former rebels. So, if we take out all the familiar personalities and events and dates and stereotypes, that's what happened in Reconstruction. A war that does not begin to destroy slavery, ends up destroying slavery, and then through a series of steps that no one foresaw, as we'll talk about in here in a minute, this effort to reconstitute the United States begins. So here's something I've never given this talk before, and Nothing like saying something out loud in front of hundreds of people to hear just how stupid it actually is. So here's what I wrote when I really believed this day before yesterday. If we focus on the central arc in that story of destroying slavery and remaking the Constitution, we can see that all the key elements of the drama coalesced between August 1864 and July 1970. Now that's strangely specific for a reason. Between August 1964 and July 1970, which are not the dates that anybody else gives. There's two possible explanations for that. We'll just assume that one that I'm just wrong is not true for right now, because you're trapped in here listening to me. Let's see if I can make the case. Before that, there is no Reconstruction. After that, the larger course of Reconstruction has been largely fixed, with the struggles of a steadily decreasing number of states playing out to a common defeat, victims of violence and intimidation. Now we know, and you've heard earlier today, that Reconstruction is playing out across the continent at the same time, that there are wars going on against American Indians at the same time, and all those things are real, and all those things are important. And the reverberations of Reconstruction in the North are very powerful. But if the point of Reconstruction is to reconstitute the nation without slavery, we have to look at the South and slavery. So, those dates are controversial, but here's why I believe them. From many people's points of view, this starts too early and ends too late, but that's my point. Because the Civil War and Reconstruction were not distinct and disconnected, stacked on top of one another, like chapters in a textbook, broken in two by Appomattox and Lincoln's assassination. Instead, that is the very center of the story, where we usually break the story, where some of our great books about the Civil War stop, and where some great books about Reconstruction start. It's that space in between that holds the solution to some of our puzzles. So we must understand the war years as war, not just as a backdrop to Reconstruction. The people lived in all this. One thing you'll notice, 1864 to 1870 is less than sometimes than people take to get through junior high and high school. And some people who were in junior high back when I was already earning a steady living is what I would point out to you. It's a short period of time for this remarkable revolution. But part of that is within the war itself. And without understanding the presence of the war in the people who are living through and making and resisting Reconstruction, there's no understanding Reconstruction. But here's the thing. We need to understand that Reconstruction is not the war's aftermath, but its culmination. Okay? So, in other words, rather than thinking of war and Reconstruction as separate events, separate eras with separate leading characters, instead they are woven together. You can't understand the full meaning of the war without understanding what it culminated in, and you can't understand Reconstruction without understanding its roots, not just in the results of the war, but in the fighting of the war. Now, interpretation of Reconstruction generally looks forward to what accomplished and, more important, failed accomplished. But people back then, just like us, are processing what we just experienced, what we knew, what we've known. And what they had just known was the profound dislocations, profound suffering, profound loss of the Civil War. They knew who the enemies were. The Republicans of the North knew that it was the Confederates, but also the Democrats across the street. They knew what wrongs needed to be righted. They knew what sins needed to be avenged. And it's that energy that animates a large part of what's going on in Reconstruction, because these are things that happened 18 months ago. The dirt on your son's grave is still raw while you're thinking about how you're going to vote. Okay? You've got to realize that these two things are so tightly woven together. Without understanding that feeling, the war, its continuing pain, there's no way to understand Reconstruction. Now, when we look at each major decision in a story on its own terms, knowing what people at the time could have known, we can see that how things happen and why things happen are the same thing. There's no force that runs through history that events just float on like lily pads. Instead, events are history. The events, the unique, unreplicable constellation of things that happen are what history is. And unless you understand how each of those crystallized, you cannot understand anything that happened afterwards. So here's the strange thing. Nothing made these events inevitable, but once they'd happened, they left an indelible mark. So as we try to picture how it was that this revolution, unfinished though it was, came to the United States that had not foreseen it just 5 years earlier, we have to understand that. And here's the other thing too. Events that seem like obstacles were the very things that enabled powerful changes to happen. The example I gave you before is the clearest example. Without secession, there is no emancipation. Okay? That's the way to think about these things, is that history moves by counterpoint, by reaction, not on straight lines. Without the resistance at every stage to Reconstruction, there would not have been Reconstruction. So let's look at the key events embraced by that August 64 to July 70 things is what I'm talking about. At the beginning of 1864, no president of the United States had won a second term since Andrew Jackson. If you don't take anything else away tonight, isn't that amazing? As you think about the election coming up, no president, 30 years, give or take, had been reelected. And nothing can be taken for granted. The Democrats of the North remained surprisingly strong for a party that had been branded as traitors and out of national office for 4 years. They sustained newspapers and office holders and showed strength across the North outside of New England. They held about 45% of Northern voters. They published tracts and kept powerful speakers in the field. They roused the faithful. They appealed to voters who might waver in their faith in Lincoln and his party. And George McClellan, who would have been the youngest president in American history had he been elected, was remarkably popular. Now, immediately after the Democrats had declared a war a failure in their convention, and something else to think about as you're getting ready to watch the conventions, think about this for a bad move. To come to your convention and say, it's too bad the war's a failure, we're going to have to, get rid of Lincoln, negotiate with the Confederates, try to find a way out of all this. Sherman takes Atlanta almost instantly, which reminds you of important things that even in our own time, surprising stuff's going to happen. I mean, it's happening all the time right now, but these kinds of sudden pivots can happen. And then also, Sheridan takes the Valley, which I believe is about as important because A, the Valley is close to Washington, D.C., but Sherman has not done any of the burning and destroying for which he becomes famous before the election of 1864, but Sheridan does, the burning of the Valley. So people really want to see what this kind of war taken to its destructive purpose would look like. Look at Philip Sheridan. And the other thing that does too is a triumph over the guerrillas who have been waging war against the Union Army in Virginia throughout the war. So watching all of this in October, in August, things are looking so terrible. Lincoln does not think he's going to be re-elected. And he writes a memo to his cabinet and asks them to sign it without reading it, saying that if this appears likely now, I'm not re-elected, I will aid the next person coming in to try to save the Union because he's going to have a really hard time doing it. So August 24th, Lincoln writes that. Okay. So I guess he didn't have good polls to know exactly what was going to happen. Like today, however, we already know what's going to happen. And he watched the Electoral College carefully, and he realized that just losing one or two large states, New York or Pennsylvania, could make enormous difference. Plus, he really needed not just to win, but he needed the moral victory because he knew that he had to do what I'm talking about. He has to reconstitute the United States in some ways. He has to put it back together. Breaking it apart was not the hard part. It's trying to put it back together once it's been broken that's so challenging. And here's what happened. If I could have the map up on the screen now, that would be great. So Lincoln won by about a 400 and some thousand margin over McClellan, but a shift of 80,000 well-placed votes in certain key states would have thrown the election to McClellan. That's all right. It's going to be dramatic when it appears. Pay no attention to the one behind the screen. Yes, there we go, yes. I'm going to work as hard as I can. I get no applause. So what you can see here is how many Democratic blue votes there are for Abraham Lincoln in 1864. In the middle of the greatest crisis in American history, nearly half of white northern men will not vote for Abraham freaking Lincoln. Okay? It gives you some idea of the challenges of this reconstituting the Union. It's not just North versus South. Even in the greatest challenge, think about what this looks like in World War II, how people followed behind FDR, who many people had hated. But here, many people will not vote for Abraham Lincoln. Despite all the advantage the Republicans enjoyed, close to half of American voters voted against him. He received the same share of votes he won in 1860. There's no great national change of heart. Now this will sound like I'm just picking on my gracious host here, but supposedly the Gettysburg Address persuaded everybody. What were we thinking about? Of course, this is a war for freedom. But no, almost nobody changed their mind. Almost 4% of Democrats changed their votes from Democrat to Republican in the Civil War. So, if you had, social media, I bet he could have done it. But as it was, he was not able to. And here's something to think about. Had there been a parliamentary system, Lincoln might very well have not survived the summer of 1864, when it looked as if the two great United States armies were stalemated. So, the Constitution, which shall reappear a little bit later, in many ways saves the United States. There's a regularly scheduled election coming up. One reason that Gettysburg is invaded in 1863 is Lee is trying to show the North that Lincoln is not protecting them. So they're watching. So politics and war making are integrated every step of the way. I believe that this election marks, if there has to be a turning point in the Civil War, this is it. It's not a battle. It's this election. And without that, nothing else in the story is going to be the same. If George McClellan wins, all bets are off on anything that looks like Reconstruction. So this is coming very late in the war. Now we know that this is happening. Gettysburg was important mainly, and this is important, for what didn't happen. What didn't happen is that Lee was not able to successfully invade the North and dislodge the faith that Lincoln could protect the North. That could have changed everything as well. So it's really important. But it's important in the larger context of things that did happen and didn't happen. As I was driving up today, I was thinking about this. This is kind of the dark matter, which accounts for most of the universe. Okay? There are things that didn't happen that are the dark matter of the Civil War. And that's as much as I've developed that idea. Just want to be honest. It sounded kind of good though for just 2 sentences. We'll see how. But even after this election, the results of the war, the consequence, the culmination of the war remained remarkably open. Lincoln declared in his second inaugural message that the presidential election had been a mandate on emancipation. Quote, "The voice of the people now for the first time heard upon the question." And that's true. Think about it. Slavery is being destroyed without ever a popular vote in the North, without any kind of a referendum. The Republican candidates elected and re-elected in 1860, 61, 62, and even 63 had forthrightly opposed slavery and the slave power, but they had never run on the basis of the immediate and uncompensated end of slavery. The main steps towards slavery's destruction, the Emancipation Proclamation and the enlistment of newly freed enslaved men and soldiers, had come entirely from Abraham Lincoln, as you know, acting on his own as commander-in-chief. The strongest blows against slavery had necessarily come without electoral mandate or even legislative provision. The most important change in American history, entirely a presidential action. All Republicans, including Lincoln, knew that this couldn't be the foundation on which to reconstitute the Union without slavery. They knew that they were going to have to amend the Constitution if they were going to be able to drive the war to what they were trying to do. And that's the next big event in Reconstruction, which also occurs before the end of the war. Now, the Democrats had always wanted to negotiate an end to slavery and the war at the same time, allowing slaveholders to slow or qualify the course of emancipation. But Republicans, pushed by hundreds of thousands of petitioners, many of them women, many of them African American, knew they needed to preclude such possibilities before the war ended, when the wartime legal foundations of emancipation might be challenged by the courts or by Democratic members of Congress. So this is the Lincoln movie, which I know seemed to many people like a very strange way to, you can make one big movie about Abraham Lincoln and this is what it's about? Well, it turns out that this is why. That unless you get the 13th Amendment in place before the war ends, everything else is at risk. The Democrats bitterly resisted the 13th Amendment. They claimed that the Constitution should not be altered, that the Founding Fathers were wiser than we are, and that their handiwork should not be altered in the midst of a national crisis, especially when you have a large part of the states not even able to vote for it. More viscerally, many white Northerners expected that with the end of slavery, black men would stream northward to compete for white jobs, and Democrats did not hesitate to say, white daughters and wives. So by resisting the Republicans on the amendment, the Democrats could champion themselves as the defenders of the white North. They would also reestablish their place as the leading party in the South, which people could see was going to come back in. So that's the thing too. Even before Reconstruction, people have realized if slavery's gone and the 3/5 clause is gone, the South is potentially more powerful than it has been before. So hold on to that thought for a minute. You're probably still thinking about dark matter, but let it go. Let it go. I have it. But the 13th Amendment did pass, of course, in January 1865. And that established the baseline for everything else. So now we have the two most important foundations in place, neither of which could have been counted on only weeks before they happened. Lincoln's re-election and the passage of the 13th Amendment before surrender. By themselves, neither of those things settled the big problem, how to reconstitute the United States without slavery. Now Lincoln thought that with military victory, the amendment might be enough. That the only change necessary to the Constitution that he revered so much might have already been made. In his speech 2 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln, to the surprise and disappointment of many people who came together to hear a victory speech, instead heard him come in and kind of worry about Louisiana and Reconstruction in Louisiana, the only state by April 1865 that had followed the steps that he hoped every other southern state would follow. Get 10% of the loyal voters to cast a ballot, they could apply to come back in, you're back in the United States. That's Lincoln's plan. And he said, listen, what we need is the states to resume their proper relationship to the federal government, and people take an oath, and our goal is to write a new constitution for them and create a new state government. He says he always referred to the so-called Confederate states. He never recognized the reality of Southern nationalism. And so, because he doesn't believe that the states could leave. Now, other Republicans said, yes, sir, they did. In fact, they are now conquered territories. They committed, a great phrase, state suicide. But Lincoln didn't believe that. So Lincoln is looking for the smoothest way to reconstitute the Union now without slavery. So half of that formula has been accomplished formally. Reconstituting the United States without slavery. Slavery is now, constitutionally at least, abolished. Now this April 11th speech marked Lincoln's first public mention of limited black suffrage. And his sport was almost a throwaway line. Quote, I would myself prefer that it were now conferred upon the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers, he said. That was enough to trigger John Wilkes Booth's assassination of him. But it was not enough to lay a foundation for what Reconstruction would become only 2 years later. So you got to think about this, how quickly this is moving. So when Lincoln is assassinated, he has not laid out anything that looks like a plan for the Reconstruction that occurs. In fact, he's laid out an alternative vision. And this last speech, like all the things that he did, including the Gettysburg Address, are a speech of the moment, despite their transcendent beauty. He's trying to solve a problem before him right now. This is Speech's concluding line, and thus his last public utterance pointed toward unfinished work rather than great accomplishment. Quote, in the present situation, as the phrase goes, it may be my duty to make some new announcement to the people of the South. I am considering and shall not fail to act when satisfied that action will be proper. But not a lot to go on there. I might at some time do something. Stay tuned. Now, weekly newspapers had no time to report Abraham Lincoln's last speech before they also had to report his assassination. So the speech is kind of lost in the news. And people, ever since, had dreamed that Lincoln would somehow have been able to reunify the United States with his characteristic wisdom and justice. His election mandate, his popularity with his party, his political instinct, his growing sense of justice for African Americans would surely have been great gifts to the nation. All that people of the time knew, however, was that even Abraham Lincoln had not told them what to do when the war ended. Or they had told them what he believed, and they didn't believe him. And this is the third moment in the defining story. It's something else that didn't happen. Lincoln living and pursuing a plan that he never defined. Instead, Andrew Johnson is suddenly president. And again, setting aside what we know, it's remarkable to go back and read the newspapers. The only thing that I've been able to find that Democrats and Republicans agree on is that Andrew Johnson is amazingly good. How fortunate we are to have him at this moment. Andrew Johnson intended to follow the path laid out by Abraham Lincoln. Now, they both say that because the Democrats were hoping he would come back and be a Democrat again, and the Republicans were hoping, well, we just elected him. Along with Abraham Lincoln, he was vetted, right? You all checked him out, right? He must be good. So Andrew Johnson intended to follow the path laid out by Lincoln for Reconstruction, the nation. He agreed that so-called Confederates had never left the Union, despite their desperate efforts to do so. And he believed that it was his constitutional responsibility to find loyal men, small versions of himself, within each of the southern states who would assume the responsibility for returning those states to the Union, acknowledging the end of slavery and the failure of secession. One reason he could do this, I'm just going to go back where I wanted to go here. Since we got a applause line for putting up, I'm going to use it as much as possible. That's the presidential election of 1860. You'll see there's a lot of colors up there. And all the yellow are Constitutional Union Party members. And the blue in the upper left-hand corner of the South are Stephen Douglas. And Johnson looks at this reasonably and thinks, those guys can't completely have given up their love for the Union over the last few years of war. They must really, and then Lincoln believed this till the day he died, that there must be a love of Union deep down in there somewhere. That they just had a chance, that they've been bullied by the slaveholders, they've been forced into this. So Johnson comes in and says, if I can tap this large area of people who voted for the Union, albeit with slavery in 1860, then maybe we can put the country back together. Like Lincoln, he wanted to build a national party of white men, of national loyalty and goodwill, who would help unify the nation. The one event people know about Reconstruction, Lincoln's assassination, did not seem at the time to mark a new direction. Johnson is self-consciously carrying Lincoln's banner. The last conversation Lincoln had before he was assassinated with an official was with Andrew Johnson. We don't know what they said. Republicans in Congress in 1865 occupy an anomalous position. They've never been more powerful because they won this big election in 64, but they're not in session when Andrew Johnson oversees the reunification of the United States. The thing that the war has been directed toward, they're not there when it's happening. Now, they're not of one mind themselves, and they're not even divided into clearly defined blocks. The Republicans struggle to determine what they should do when Congress reconvenes in December. From that point on, they're playing catch-up. They're responding rather than directing. The Republicans are trying to dig out of the hole that they've been in because the Constitution did not have them meeting at this time. Now, they face competing needs. Though everyone wanted the federal soldiers to return home, the Republicans needed troops to stay in the South to protect the freed people and to prevent the rise of the recent rebels to local and state power. Though everyone wanted the war to cease, the Republicans needed to delay formal reunification until the former Confederate states would acknowledge that they simply could not restore their former leaders to power. So you can see, in the same way that the Democrats charged Lincoln with prolonging the war to get the 13th Amendment passed, people are charging the Republicans with, you don't want to put the nation back together because you want it to stay malleable long enough to reunify the way you want to. And there's some truth to that. They don't want it to coalesce too quickly the way that Johnson has in mind. Because if you're really going to build a true reunification of the United States, you're going to have to do it on a deeply altered South. Now, the Republicans didn't have a plan that they could agree on for accomplishing these purposes, and they did not have a president who accepted the fundamental premises. The Democrats had it easy at this time. They knew exactly what they wanted. The quickest and least disruptive reunification of the nation possible, with the smallest change possible in the status of black people, and with former Democrats back in power. They too wanted a national party. They said, we were the national party until we threw it all away in a divided convention in Charleston in 1860. We should have won 1860 if we hadn't fragmented. We are the national party. How does it, Republicans, they're like 6 years old now. How can they claim to be the great national party we are? They also possessed a strength the Republicans did not. Appeals to racial loyalty. Racism. All the ink the Democrats spent on ridiculing, trivializing, and caricaturing black people was there for a cold-blooded purpose. And the amount of it is just heartbreaking. I mean, you pick up any Democratic newspaper from these years, and it's just drenched in this vitriolic language. The Democrats knew the Republicans did not know what to say or do about black Americans. During the election of 1864 that they win, they barely mentioned slavery, even though they're working behind the scenes to pass the 13th Amendment. They asked Frederick Douglass not to go out on the hustings because they are trying. So here's, again, you see how strange this is. They're trying to end slavery, so they don't want to talk about it, because they know that that could be just feeding into the Democrats' plans. And frankly, even when they did celebrate the end of slavery, they did not celebrate the character and capacity of those held in slavery, other than the black men who fought as soldiers. They portrayed the fall of slavery as the fall of the great obstacle to the true unity of the United States. The Democrats warned that black voting lay behind every Republican plan, but it didn't until it suddenly did. And here's how the next event suddenly happened. Across the former Confederacy in the fall of 1865, voters elected men they knew and trusted to represent them in their state legislatures and the United States Congress that would convene in December. Voters believed that these men, whether Unionists or Secessionists, before 1861, had demonstrated their loyalties to their communities through the crime of crisis by standing with them in the Confederacy. And they would serve those same communities now. The conditions had changed. They accepted the end of slavery, they said, and we accepted the 13th Amendment. They say, we accept the fundamental premises of the reunification of the United States without slavery. No slavery and no secession. Let us back in and let us run everything. And slavery's gone. Don't worry about it. We'll put it back just almost as it was. Right? Now, Republicans were livid at such arrogance or ignorance. In their eyes, any man who had supported the so-called Confederacy should automatically be disqualified from serving the United States. Only truly loyal men, those men who had defied popular opinion to defend the Union, deserve positions of trust. The former Confederates who planned to descend on Washington would support Johnson and the Democrats, preventing any chance of a reunion based on justice. You know, for a long time, it was like the Republicans are just doing this for party advantage. Okay, that's good. You want all the machinery of a party behind the things that you believe in, right? And so they say, if we are going to restore the United States to a form it's never been in, a truly just country, we're going to have to run it. You can't trust the Democrats, and you can't trust the white South, and so therefore we are going to be the saviors of the United States, and they're justified in thinking so. They needed to rally white voters behind the idea of ending slavery, and when they did, they found themselves saying things that they did not say a year earlier about black people's capacities, about black people's virtues, about black people's bravery. The Democrats go crazy because Republicans brag on the United States colored troops so much. And it's the Republicans act, and then their ideas grow into fill behind it. And the ideas are our allies, black Americans, are worthy allies. You can literally watch ideas of greater justice emerging. Not as the cause in some ways, but as the result. White Northerners, sometimes for far-sighted, even altruistic reasons, sometimes for instrumental reasons that had little to do with black people as persons, and most often for reasons that combine the two, created a space into which black people could and did fill with their own purpose. Black people weren't waiting for white people to give them something. It's like, great, slavery's gone. Let's start building our churches. Let's start building our schools. Let's start putting our families back together. Let's start crawling out of the system of slavery and getting the results of the labor of our own hands. They are seizing the smallest opening to take that for themselves, just as they had during the war. But now they're taking it in a new civic sphere in which they are, men and women, are seizing new responsibilities for themselves. Nobody who's white is telling these black people to resist their former owners on wages, even to the points of when they're being assaulted. They're not telling them, give a dime every week to the teacher so your children can go to school. They're not telling them, out of the money that you somehow scraped out of slavery, to build a church of your own where there are not white people looking over your shoulders. Those are the things that black people are doing for themselves in this environment that's been created, not for that purpose. Another way that I feel like reading over all this stuff very carefully, I'm really impressed with the Freedmen's Bureau, which is often discounted as being kind of weak. But here's what I see. It went from being a purely wartime relief measure to being a critical element in every part of the South. It created enough legal and military and philanthropic and educational and moral space for Reconstruction to get a toehold. If you'd not had the opportunity for people to come forward and declare a marriage that they had had under slavery that had been against the law, what would things have been? If you'd not had an ally for young white women who want to come from the North to teach children who'd been in slavery a month earlier, where would we have been? If you'd not had the soldiers with the Freedmen's Bureau to try to protect the free people as best they could, where would we have been? In all those ways, the Freedmen's Bureau, in many ways, was Reconstruction. And it goes from March 1865 to January 1869. So it actually embraces almost the entirety of this period that I see as the great pivot for Reconstruction. In fact, the Freedmen's Bureau is the only real continuity in the evolution of Reconstruction. Johnson does veto it, but on the same day that he vetoes it, it's put back into place by Republicans. Now, if you look at Washington at this time, as we usually do, the story is all disjointed. Is Johnson being impeached or not? Why does he keep vetoing stuff? If they know he's going to veto, why do they put it up there? Guys, is he ever going to leave? You know, how long? And who are the radicals? And why don't they wear name tags that identifies who belongs to? It's kind of a mess. So as Republicans overturn one veto after another, they say what we're going to have to do is find a way to remake the spirit of the South. But here's the thing. I can't see any evidence that people changed their minds during Reconstruction. The Democrats come out of Reconstruction believing the same things they went into it. White Southerners believe the same things they went into it. Black Americans believe the same things. Republicans are the dynamic element because they're scurrying, trying to redeem this war with something that looks like justice. So Southern whites and Democrats wanted to change as little as possible. They're literally reactionary. They're trying to stop anything from changing. The Republicans, for their part, bless you, it was the very intransigence of white Southerners that drove Reconstruction farther than most Republicans could have imagined. Okay? So Johnson's got presidential Reconstruction, the Republicans are divided, the white South is in control, and then the white South, just as it had in secession, you could argue just as it had during the war, overplays its hand. We are right now, Pete talked about the sesquicentennial. Right now, we're at the sesquicentennial of the period between the Memphis race riots and the New Orleans race riots. Okay? Exactly 150 years ago, you're watching radical Reconstruction begin because the white South inflicts violence of such public and obvious scale that the people of the North say, this is not why my son died. This is not why we gave our father, so that the white South could come back up and shoot black people in the streets of the major cities of the South. So Reconstruction pivots again. You have these different things in place, but the outrage against white violence in the South, as well as the daily violence that the Freedmen's Bureau is reporting. The white South, if it sort of just absorbed as much of Reconstruction as possible, instead of fighting back, it might have gotten away with not having much more change. But as it is, the Republicans are mobilized by this. And Republicans are outraged that the white South does not even think they were wrong. Basically, the white South says we were whipped. They say that we were defeated, but they don't say that we were wrong. And they don't say the one thing the Republicans really want them to say, that we sinned in slavery and we sinned in secession. Instead, the white South refuses to acknowledge any of those things. So there's this gridlock. They're looking for the true repentance, and they're not finding it. And the Republicans say the only way there's going to be a true reunification of this nation without slavery is if the people who perpetuated slavery undergo a moral regeneration. That there is no redemption without acknowledgement of sin. And the white South shows no inclination at all of doing this. And this is how we explain the next surprising chapter in Reconstruction. Something that people did not think was going to happen. The 14th Amendment. You look back at the 14th Amendment now, which is arguably the most important, most living amendment in the 20th century. It bears the marks of its moment of creation. It's a lot about the rebellion and about debts and about the unrepentant Southern legislatures and Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Bill. And Republicans weren't sure, they didn't agree about this either. But the white South seemed incapable of and uninterested in instituting anything like order or justice. And so Republicans became clear by September are going to win almost every state in the North, and that Reconstruction would be strengthened. Okay. So here's another important thing. I'd have to say that too often we historians divide history up by specialty. That there are legal historians and military historians and social historians and cultural historians and historians of women and historians of African Americans. As you can see, Reconstruction won't work that way. We're going to have all the pieces alive all the time. The critical agent, the conductive material in all this are voters, especially in the North. So the North sometimes looks like observers in all this. But it's the decisions they're making. They're monitoring what's going on in the South. That's going to determine what happens. So by September, it becomes clear the Republicans are going to win almost every state in the North, and Reconstruction is going to be strengthened. But here's the fact. In April 1867, the United States is as unsettled as it had been in April 1865. It is not on track to make progress. There is not a linear line, a linear path toward what we think of as Reconstruction. Instead, there are U-turns. It seems to be headed in one direction and then suddenly turns into another. The healing everyone had hoped for had instead festered. The wounds of loss infected with accusations of betrayal. White Southerners are self-righteous too. They say the white North is reneging on the deal that General Grant gave at Appomattox. That it was our understanding that all we had to do was go home. But now you keep raising the stakes. You keep wanting us to take oaths. You want us to admit a kind of wrong that we do not acknowledge. So months and years are passing without resolution. It may seem that way to you right now, but there in real time, it was really a long time. And as the months pass, Americans wonder, could things have been different? And this is a fantasy that both white Southerners and white Northerners share. If Lincoln had lived. If Lincoln had lived, we could have avoided this agony. The fact, though, was that the white South had never, for a moment, proved willing to accept more than the end of slavery and the end of the Confederacy. Former Confederates would have unleashed violence against black people, descending into the anarchy that Abraham Lincoln feared when he counseled Grant to let them up easy, whenever they faced an immediate threat. The deeply divided and scarred electorate of the North would have punished the Republicans in 1865 just as they did 2 years later had the party followed the most radical plans promoted for it. In fact, those voters supported aggressive Republican actions only because white Northerners in 1866 had seen how little white Southerners repented. So without Southern intransigence, without black codes and riots and the Ku Klux Klan and re-elected Confederate leaders and broken contracts and rampant violence against the men and women who'd been held in slavery, and without taking their children and calling them apprentices, and without flagrant, unjust business practices, there would have been no 14th Amendment. So ironically, in fact, the false starts and abrupt endings and sudden reversals and long delays of Reconstruction may have delivered the most that Reconstruction could have delivered. What we see as failure may have actually been the necessary ingredients for Reconstruction to have enacted the 14th and then the 15th Amendments. So it requires a different way of thinking about things. That if we want, Republicans should have been resolute and clear and not changed their minds and done this one thing. But as it was, they were living in real time. So we see Reconstruction move by counterpoint and reaction as well as by intention and fulfillment. Now, part of the reason for Reconstruction's halting story resulted from the very thing that they were trying to save, the Constitution. Now, the Constitution had saved the North's bacon by forcing them to have an election but not have it until the fall of 1864. But now, the Republicans are adhering to all of the schedules and processes of democracy. You're trying to put the United States back together, and so you're going to have to follow the Constitution. But that builds an enormous amount of time for the white South to mobilize itself against new black voters for delegates and conventions. The more than 6 months between the surrender and the reconvening of Congress gave Johnson time. State elections in different states across the North every year kept stirring the pots of politics. Back then, politics was a really ugly thing that people fought over. It's hard for us to imagine that it used to be that way in the past. The reliance on constitutional amendments to enact change in the South, for delegates to be elected, for conventions to be held, for new constitutions to be written. All those things slowed Reconstruction because the Republicans believed that those things were necessary to really put the country back together. And here's the origin of the final part of the key story, the 15th Amendment. The amendment came because many white northern states did not want to enact black suffrage for themselves. So it was easier, rather than to create a constitutional amendment that says that you will lose votes proportionate to the number of people you disfranchise if you don't have many people that you are disfranchising. But the point being there is we got to have this if we're going to have universal suffrage. We don't have it in the North right now, but this will lay the foundations for it to come. So the North had been struggling with all this, which feeds the Southern charges of hypocrisy. So by 1870, with the passage of the 15th Amendment and the readmission of all the Southern states, the fundamental changes of Reconstruction had been established. While federal troops would occupy some former Confederate states for another 7 years, while the Republican governments held on in the face of relentless violence and resistance, neither Congress nor the President would launch new efforts to atone for slavery and secession. So Reconstruction began to end as soon as it began. By the time the Republicans won, the emptiness of much of the victory was already apparent. All the ingredients of failure were there at the outset. Determined and often violent resistance from the great majority of Southern whites, determined but often futile efforts on the part of black Southerners to win a share of political power, fractures among moderate and radical Republicans, Northern and Southern Republicans, and black and white Republicans. These elements did not emerge over time, but were there from the outset. So the very process of winning black suffrage had exhausted the will of the North and the resources of Southern Republicans, black and white, and it exhausted the lives of many Southern Republicans, especially black ones. The white South, in losing, saw that it possessed the resource to get what it wanted if it could rouse itself to fight back. So electorally, the Republicans started losing in the North as soon as they started winning in the South. Ulysses Grant won 700,000 votes in the black South and won the election by 300,000 votes. So the Northern Republicans are caught. They need the votes of the black South, but they are not going to win in the North if they don't. This is why you have, for the next 30 years, the longest period of closely contested elections in American history. The Democrats are not crushed by all this as they should have been, but instead have right at half the American electorate. So what was won and lost in Reconstruction depends on where we start and stop the story. Measured from 1860, the accomplishments of 1870 could hardly be believed. The destruction of American slavery and the creation of universal male suffrage. Judged from the perspective of 1865, when Republicans called for economic as well as political revolution, Reconstruction seems a disappointment. Judged from the perspective of the early 20th century, the gains of freedom from Reconstruction seem cruelly ephemeral, as every Southern state in the decade between 1890 and 1908, in 18 years, writes new constitutions that basically erase the gains of the Reconstruction constitutions. But if we extend the story to 1965, we see that the beachheads of the 14th and 15th Amendments helped redefine American history, laying the foundations for the greatest moral revolution in American history of the Civil Rights Movement. If we extend the story to the early 21st century, the hope and the despair interweave, so it seems that we cannot pull them apart. Earlier generations of historians knew exactly what Reconstruction was. They could have given you a much simpler answer than I just have. They could have told you who the good guys were and the bad guys were. They could have told you how things proceeded on a logical basis. But I think in our own time, when we see how hard it is to separate out these things, maybe a Reconstruction that's as complex as our own time might actually be easier for us to comprehend. If we're to understand the central drama of our nation's history, the reconstitution of the nation without slavery, we need to disassemble the story into its basic parts. We need to see the centrality of war and its events, all the actors and interaction, and how unlikely it was that Reconstruction followed the course that it did. The familiar personalities matter just as much as ever. But perhaps those roles make more sense if we understand that the plot of the great drama in which they were engaged was not scripted beforehand. You can't possibly have believed all that, so I'll look forward now to the question and answer part and found exactly what parts that you don't believe. Let's go.
Question?
You go from mic to mic. Mic to mic. For you? Well, or you?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for a very insightful, bold, and articulate presentation.
Right, that's all we have time for tonight. Thanks very much.
I do want to push back on one thing in terms
Yeah, sure.
of your date of August 1864 for the start of Reconstruction, because in my mind there were halting steps already begun in 1863, and I think politically West Virginia, I think of coastal Carolina, I think of New Orleans, I think of Eastern Virginia. Even though it wasn't a national
Yeah.
Wasn't Reconstruction already starting by 1863?
Yeah, that's a great point, which I really resent. My point, and I think actually the next time I give this, I will go ahead and say this, because that really is a good point. The point is, they wouldn't have taken without Lincoln's re-election, is my point. Is that, in some ways, there's a famous book called Rehearsal for Reconstruction about the islands off the South Carolina coast. You could argue they were Reconstruction, right? If you take seriously what else I was saying, that what Reconstruction really is the creation of these small spaces that then African Americans use to create and expand their own sphere. It's happening everywhere the opportunity exists. You could say it begins in Fortress Monroe, right? So that's the tricky thing, is how do you say, give it enough shape about what the essential conditions were for what we know as Reconstruction to unfold, as opposed to all the seeds that fed into it. That's a great point, and I do appreciate you making it. I appreciate you letting me kid around too. Who else we got? There we go.
Yeah, I've got two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, with most successfully attended, it was very annual. You start with finding something, and you can go to Antietam, and then you can go to Gettysburg, and
Right.
right down the line. Well, Reconstruction is a big, huge time period. So in some ways, it's nice because you can do more with it.
I think that's called it gives you enough rope.
Okay. So my first question is, do you know that if National Park Service, other branches of the federal government are planning to, what they're planning to do?
Well, that's two different questions. Do I know that? Yes, they're working hard on that. I think there was actually been some discussion about it at your conference here. Greg Downs and Kate Mazur, two historians, are working with the National Park Service to help plan it. Are either of them here? Yeah, would you like to talk about it, Greg?
I already did. I don't want to take up.
Okay. But the answer is yes.
There's reason for hope.
It's freaking awesome, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And my last question is, you may have said this, and I may have missed it, and I'm sorry. When does Reconstruction end?
Yeah, I didn't say that. If you take the broader view that I did, and you grant the sense of responsibility for African Americans, I think that the idea that Reconstruction's over in 1877 does them a disservice, because they bravely continued to vote throughout the 1880s and the 1890s into the early 20th century. You could argue that if the point of Reconstruction is to create a space for representation among all people, that it doesn't end until the disfranchisement constitutions of the turn of the 20th century. I think that's my answer. I wrote an absurd amount about all that in this book, and therefore I have a vested interest in thinking that's the answer. Professor Clinton.
Yes, I know that as historians we're all obsessed with chronology and dating. And
Sequence.
Sequence, I see. That you were very precise in your
That's
dates
right.
at the beginning, although you hallucinated into the 1970s and gave us a gasp back there. But you went to 1870, but
I see.
at one moment we were back in...
I can make that argument at the end too.
For Tennessee youth.
Yeah, okay.
But let's say, so I'm dating and I'm thinking back to the last time I think you talked about Reconstruction,
Yeah.
Society of Civil War Historians.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I mean, there was this whole question of when are we going to get a really good take on it, and how are we going to redo it? And although at that time, I'll be honest, I thought you were a little slick, Eddie.
Yep.
But today, you were brother Your brother. Yes, and I thought you were giving us an exhortation.
Yeah, but
And going into the moral issues and going into the moral revolutions that went on.
Yeah.
And so I know that you've been working these years on brothers and sisters. So I'm really interested in how you make it, very defined by elections. So I wonder if you could just expand on that and talk about the moral universe of those deprived of the vote who actually had moral force.
yeah, I think that's a mistake we often make, is acting as if people who are deprived of elections aren't affected by elections.
They're not affected, but...
Yeah, but no, I'm just saying that there is such a division between political history, electoral history, and other kinds of history that we often forget that what the state does matters. And for me, it's not about elections, it's about state power and capacity. And so...
You mean small f. I mean, you're not talking about state versus federal.
No, I mean the power of the government, right? At all levels, local and state and federal. And that if we don't think about what is possible one year and not possible the next for, say, an enslaved woman who's watched all 3 of her children be sold away, because now there is a directive from the Freedmen's Bureau to take a register and to actually help people, families back together. So that's what I think, is that there's been an unfortunate sense that in the way that we used to fight about, can military history and social history be put together? Well, you showed us that it can be, and that it must. Now I think we can actually see that electoral, and for me, electoral history, I'm not as interested in political history in the sense of, I don't want to read Andrew Johnson's letters again. I want to know why people voted as they did. It's the closest thing we have to an index of what was motivating people. And I think it's significant that how much African American men and women bled to get the suffrage and to vote. And so, yeah, I believe elections matter a whole lot, and that they're not distinct from social history or cultural history in the way that we sometimes imagine.
I appreciate that.
All right.
Thanks for laying it out.
Thank you.
But I will also say that there's a whole movement of the war coming home. So again, that in some ways is trying to superimpose over the political map you lay out for us, which I think is, exciting. When we applauded, we were saying new ways to think about Democrats and Republicans, taking our mind off our troubles. So thank you for
Thanks, Scott. Thank you. Yes?
Hi, David Keller from Chicago, Illinois. 2 questions. My first question is very simple. The map that you have on the screen, is that on the web, or is that something that...
Yeah, so all of this is from, thank you for asking, because
This is a simple question.
So what this is a part of the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. And we're building a digital atlas of American history. And it has a lot of really cool things in it. We're getting ready to redo all those maps in the next few months. And that's a map right there of the foreign-born population in every county in the United States from 1850 to 2010. And it's dynamic and it moves. And so those maps, so that you can move back and forth. So go to Digital Scholarship Lab and University of Richmond, and you'll see there and a bunch of other cool ones.
All right. And so
Thank you for asking.
My main question was the map that you had on there got me thinking about. I have some ancestors that were in the West Virginia area,
right.
And families that were divided during the war. Can you just speak to the reconciliation of some of that? Did families come back together? Were they separated forever? What is that story like?
So my own ancestry is Appalachian, and so I made it this far in this speech without saying something I often say, but I went to Andrew Johnson Elementary School in East Tennessee, and so I asked my grandfather one time why we never talked about the Civil War and why there was no statue of the Civil War in our town. He said, "Son, we shot each other," and that's why I feel like I can be a good. I guess somebody missed long enough for me to still show up. So, but as you know, I hate to say this because I hate to perpetuate the stereotype, but feuding in West Virginia, southwestern Kentucky, East Tennessee, is fueled in large part by wartime loyalties. And that it's a matter of life or death for generations whether or not you join the United States or stayed with or joined the Confederacy. And, you know, for almost into the 20th century, Virginia and West Virginia fight over West Virginia's share of the debt that Virginia still suffered. So I think that there's been very little reconciliation. I think, you know, I think for a long time Virginians just thought it was a power play, unjust military takeaway, that if West Virginians had really been allowed to vote the way they wanted to, that they would still, many of them would still have been in Virginia. So all those are good examples of why it's the wartime experience of watching somebody be shot in front of your eyes, or losing your father, you grew up an orphan, and all this, that you can go back and track. You know, Catherine was asking, you know, mentioning elections. The line is that people voted as they shot for 30 or 40 years afterwards. So that's what I think, is that we do ourselves a disservice by drawing too sharp a lines between different eras of American history. The point of chronology is not to divide things, but actually to unite things, to suggest how one thing leads in surprising ways into another, and how in many ways any history that happens never really fades away, but leaves lingering traces. So war are the most powerful ones of all. I don't see anyone else at the other microphone, and I see Professor Carmichael poised at the steps here with my teacherly peripheral vision. And so I will take that as a sign that I should only talk for another hour and a half. Now, I take that as a sign that, thank you all very much. This is a complicated discussion.
Ed, we'll love to have you back when you figure out that black matter on the side. So.